Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban has met with former US President Donald Trump in his Mar-a-Lago home in Florida. That will likely aggravate and frustrate Western allies, along with the similar secretive trips he made to Russia and China in recent days. The Trump visit is the latest stop in what Orban has labelled his peace mission.
Since taking over the rotating presidency of the Council of the EU at the beginning of July, Hungary's Viktor Orban has been making himself busy. He's been on a self-styled peace initiative, meeting world leaders and numbering the trips as he goes. His first trip was to Kyiv, where he met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, before heading to Moscow for talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. A trip that irked many in Brussels and across the EU. On his third trip, which he dubbed Peace Mission 3.0, Orban headed to Beijing, where he met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. He said that China was key to creating the conditions for peace between Ukraine and Russia. Then, a flight to Washington, D.C. for the NATO summit. On the summit sidelines, he met with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan for Peace Mission 4.0. He reportedly asked for Turkey's support for the Hungarian peace initiative. The fifth instalment saw Orban head to Florida to meet with former president and current presidential candidate Donald Trump. After the meeting, Orban, a long-time Trump supporter, posted on X that Trump would solve the war in Ukraine. The Hungarian Prime Minister's unilateral push for peace has not been warmly welcomed by his NATO allies, though it did lead to a rare moment of agreement between French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
It's his choice, but let's be clear. He didn't do this as the President of the European Union for the coming 6 months. He was not in that role. It was as the Prime Minister of Hungary that he chose to make that trip. That was his choice as representative of a sovereign nation.
All of these trips by Mr. Orban happened as the Prime Minister of his country. No one wants to limit him in that, and no one would want that. But he did not act on behalf of the European Council.
These early days of his EU presidency seem to have only solidified Orban's reputation as an outsider on the inside of Europe and of NATO.
And for more on that, I'm now joined by Armida. She's a senior research fellow at Chatham House, a think tank in London. Armida, what is your take on Orban's so-called peace initiative? What's his aim?
I mean, any kind of peace initiative at the moment or peace negotiations at the moment just mean capitulation for Ukraine and are just terrible for Ukraine and European security more broadly, and only serve to undermine the EU and NATO and Ukraine itself, most importantly. I mean, he's clearly using his new platform as holding the presidency of the EU Council to try and advance his own isolationist views on this topic, but he has absolutely no mandate, but also no legitimacy to really do this.
No, you wrote an article where you said that Orban's travels tell a story of disruption. What do you mean by that?
Yes, that's a piece on the Chatham House website. By that, I mean looking at the timing. So he has undertaken all of these trips within the first 2 weeks in taking over the presidency of the EU Council. He is deliberately blurring the lines over whether he is undertaking these trips as Prime Minister of Hungary or while holding the rotating presidency. You know, if we look at the promotional materials, he has used the Hungarian presidency hashtags on promotional materials. He has displayed EU flags while being in Kyiv. So all of that serves to blur the boundaries, which the EU himself has said his trips are illegal and are in breach of the EU treaties. It's been reported in both Chinese and Russian media that he was there as a representative of the EU. So even though he himself has said, oh, that is not the case and I'm here, you know, this is a bilateral trip, the fact that that's not how it's being seen in China or in Russia is hugely problematic and just goes to the point that he is blurring the boundaries, he's trying to cause disruption, and he's trying to put forward and advance his own agenda.
Now, as we've heard in the report, both from Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron, many in the EU and the EU itself made clear that they are not on board with Orban there. But are there any tools the EU could use in response to this?
I mean, this is the million-dollar question at the moment. There's obviously the Article 7 tool, whereby a member state's voting rights could potentially be taken away, but that requires a unanimous vote in the EU Council. That's unlikely to happen because certainly Slovakia would support Orban. Others have talked about the potential of shortening the Hungarian presidency, whereby Poland's, who's next to take over the presidencies, would be extended, but that would not require a majority, but only 4 or 5 member states to vote for it. But I just can't see member states wanting to use their political capital on this, whether that's right or wrong. But I think the main thing that we can potentially do and that we need to bear in mind is that Hungary is the EU's 3rd largest net benefactor of EU funds. And so the European Commission has that huge financial leverage over Hungary at the moment, which it just hasn't used well enough yet. So looking at the Hungary problem within the EU at the moment as a threefold challenge, which, it is this disruption and abuse of using the presidency. It's also Orban's more obstructive position more broadly by blocking, EU aid for Ukraine and other positions he's taken that are quite where he's quite isolated. And then the third one is the backsliding, the democratic backsliding in Hungary itself, which Orban has very much encouraged and facilitated and enabled. So if we look at that whole challenge as a set of 3, that's where the Commission can use the financial leverage it has to try and kind of rope Orban back in.
Armida there. Chatham House in London, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We can speak now to DW correspondent Bernd Riegert in Brussels. Bernd, good to see you. Orban met with former US President Trump after the NATO summit. He's calling it a peace mission, taking into account that both of them rather have pro-Russian views. Do you think European leaders will think that this will all be to the detriment of Ukraine?
It will certainly not help Ukraine. The EU leaders are afraid that Russia could be under the impression that the West is now divided in the cause for Ukraine. And they also are afraid that Donald Trump, if he makes it back into the White House in the fall, will sell out Ukraine's interests to make a peace deal, a so-called peace deal, fast with Russia. But the EU says it's only up to Ukraine to determine and when and how ceasefire talks or peace talks could even start. So it's very difficult for the EU to see there anything positive in Orban's trip to Trump. Mr. Orban is a staunch supporter of Donald Trump, and he's more seen as a loose cannon, as a renegade by the other European leaders.
Now, this meeting, of course, Bernd, comes just after Orban met with Volodymyr Zelensky, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. It sounds like Orban is really not on the same page as European leaders.
Well, there is no common page, if you will. The EU leaders, all of them, but Orban are on the other side. They say there cannot be peace talks, and Orban is not dealing on behalf or traveling on behalf of the EU at all. Although Orban, on the other hand, says in interviews that he is seizing the moment that he is now the EU Council President and wants to use this extra weight to promote his so-called mission. So it's very difficult for the EU to handle this now. This is unprecedented. Never before an EU Council President even has acted like that.
Bernd, the EU says Orban isn't acting on its behalf. Some are even calling for him to be disciplined. Will Viktor Orban face any kind of consequences?
Well, that is also difficult. The legal services of the EU are now checking in the background if there is any possibility to strip Mr. Orban of the Council presidency. this is also unprecedented, but it's very unlikely that this will happen. The EU is now agreeing more or less on a kind of a go-slow strike concerning the Hungarian presidency, so they will not attend high-level meetings that the presidency is calling for to punish Mr. Orban. This is kind of a diplomatic punishment, if you will, but will Mr. Orban be impressed by that? That is very doubtful.
That was our correspondent Bernd Riegert in Brussels. Bernd, thank you very much.